Well, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Tim Smith. I have been working here in the wetland field in why do we have to do this? Why do we need to go through all this documentation and provide all this information in order to get the application? So Chad, I'll let you go first and then Dave can follow on from a WACA perspective.
Answer that in like a approximately 8-word sentence. To ensure development occurs in the least environmentally damaging way. Could say the law requires it, which is also true, but that's why. Make sure development happens in the least environmentally damaging way. The law is written to ensure that. So it's really that straightforward. It isn't at the whim of the project manager assigned to review a permit application. It's as you'll see in the next little period of time here, it's actually pretty logical sequence of events. And yeah, it's because we got to make sure that we're doing things in a sustainable way.
Okay. Dave.
In my mind, alternatives analysis and really the whole sequencing process, the whole sequencing procedure that falls under really hits the core tenet of the purpose of the Wetland Conservation Act. Keep in mind the purpose of the Wetland Conservation Act is this idea of a no net loss. And then to avoid wetland impacts and then replace those wetland impacts that are unavoidable with equal public value. And so sequencing or the alternatives analysis directly hits two of those main tenets of the project of the purpose of the Wetland Conservation Act alone. Now, the alternatives analysis itself is couched within the sequencing process, but the fact is that this is kind of the bread or the meat and potatoes of the review standard that we call sequencing for WACA. So absolute central tenet of the impact side of wetland management in Minnesota.
All right, so let's go on then to the why question, or I'm sorry, the what is, from the why to the what. So what is an alternatives analysis? And before I have these guys opine on that, you guys and the folks virtually can chime in on this as well. What makes up an alternatives analysis? So what are the components? What goes into the decisions that the agencies make? What are they asking you for? And if you have the nerve to go through WACA rule and all the core regulations, you'll sift all that out. But there's probably, what did we pull out? About six key elements of an alternatives analysis, depending on how you dice them up, that typically form that framework. So anybody have an idea what might be on that list?
Fulfill the purpose and need of the project without impacting them.
Okay, so purpose and need. Okay, what else? Good answer. Anything else? And you let me know if anybody's chiming in virtually. Thank you. Okay, let's just get to it then. Well, why don't you, we'll just go through the list. So what are the components? Brian got the first one there, purpose and need, but there is the water wetland dependency determination, which is more of an agency internal decision that's made, at least from the core standpoint. I think you probably do the same thing under WACA, but that is a key part that the agencies will look at in terms of the alternatives analysis. And then the practicable or feasible and prudent alternatives. The first term there is a 404 term, and then the second part is WACA. And then you have avoidance and minimization, and then for core, the LEDPA, which is the least environmentally damaging practicable alternative. And then on the WACA side, is sequencing compliance determination. So we're going to talk about each one of these in depth. I think Chad's going to go through these with us first and give an overview, and then Dave's going to kind of reflect on that. And if there are differences or little tweaks from the WACA side, he'll chime in on that, and then we'll start talking about how we apply those on particular projects. So go ahead, Chad.
All right. So can somebody give a thumbs up or something remotely to see if the audio is okay from where I'm standing? You hear me? If I talk at this volume? And am I on the camera? Am I in a good enough spot?
Audio good.
Anybody seeing my mouth move and not hearing anything?
I will say that you're backlit, so you're not,
Okay.
we can
Don't
see
stand
you,
in front of
but
the window.
over here might be a little bit nicer.
Okay. Well, there's not a lot of slides, so is this better?
Yep.
Is this okay?
Yep, that's
Not
good.
getting me from the chest down?
That's good. Yep.
Okay. That happened the last time I talked.
That's good there.
An hour after standing up here with an owl, someone online finally said, you know, we can only see you from the chest down. Not cool. Like from my chest to my knees. It was even worse than you were thinking. So let me say first, what a privilege it is to be here. Tim called and said, hey, can somebody on your staff come do this outreach thing? And I kind of sheepishly said, can I? I don't ever get to do this anymore. So this is awesome. I mean, I teach nationally to core regulators and stuff, but I just don't get to do this. I love doing this. So it's a real privilege to be here. And what you'll get from me today is essentially just a really condensed version of what all the core regulators, core project managers get. So this is it. I mean, it's right out of the regulations, and you know, I have some tips and tricks and practical advice along the way when I go through the examples. But I thought we'd start. Well, and the other thing you're going to see is, I mean, Clean Water Act and WACA are very similar. I mean, WACA came, what, 20 years after the Clean Water Act, and like a lot of states, lifted things right out of it. There's overlap. We don't regulate the same water and stuff, but you'll notice a lot of similarities. So, you know, we kind of have it easy here between the two of us. So I thought I can probably just kind of go through the logical connection between these things in like 5 or 6 minutes. I think I say that. I hope I'm not, I don't make myself, no, 5 to 60 minutes. I'll try to do it in just a few minutes, but, and then we'll get into more detail and examples, and they will, you know, add some stuff, whatever. So, so let me just kind of draw the connections between these things first and kind of explain some of them. So what we would tell all our project managers is you start with need, and there's a lot of confusion between need and purpose and alternatives. And this is the first tripping point for a lot of folks. So need is really fundamental, you know, transportation, safety, housing, you know, a need that needs to be met, all right? It isn't a specific thing. And then the purpose that comes after that is what has to be achieved to address that need. And I think this is a place where there's a lot of confusion between a purpose and an alternative to achieve that purpose. So purpose could be provide upscale single-family housing in Western Washington County. An alternative, jump ahead for just a second to contrast that, an alternative could be construct 200 unit subdivision at the corner of First and Main in Woodbury. That's one alternative to meeting a need of providing single family housing in Western Washington County or whatever. So that's an important distinction to know the difference between a purpose you're trying to achieve, and then there's many different alternative ways to achieve it. So if we get past that, things seem to be a little clearer right out of the gate. So what the purpose of the purpose is to define our range of alternatives, because every alternative that we consider has to achieve that purpose. So just in your mind, think of the example I gave, you know, single family housing in some region where you determine there's a market, there's a need. And so if the purpose is overly restrictive, like 200 units at the corner of First and Main, I mean, there's one alternative that can achieve that. You can't do an alternatives analysis because there's one that'll achieve that purpose. So it's too restrictive a purpose. It could also be too general, as, you know, provide housing. Okay, is there an upland in Western North Dakota you could use? So there needs to be some geographic component, right? That kind of where the market, you know, we've determined there's a market for this thing, you know, so it isn't an art. It starts to make sense, I think, when you go through examples, how it can be too restrictive or too general. The purpose drives the alternatives. Another example of a pitfall is a purpose that's overly speculative, is what we call it, or build it and they will come. The purpose is to fill this wetland so I can sell it to somebody to come build something on it. If you think ahead, because you guys have done, most of you have done this, if you think ahead, we're going to say, well, can you avoid wetlands a little more? Can you minimize? You can't even answer that question because you don't know what's going to go there. You don't know how big a parking lot you need, how big a building. So it's kind of obvious when you think about going through the process, how that purpose isn't valid. You know, you can't just fill a wetland to fill a wetland and then figure out later what's going to go there. So the proposal has to be evaluated against a purpose that's meaningful. What was another major point here? Okay, so that's purpose, defines your range of alternatives. Water dependency for the Corps is something you basically don't need to worry about. It's kind of internal, like Tim said, because almost nothing is water dependent. Water dependent in our regulations means has to be located, not in the water, but in a special aquatic site, a wetland, a riffle and pool complex, vegetated shallows. It's a very specific list of 7 things. Almost nothing has to, by its very nature, be located in a wetland or a riffle pool complex. It's like wetland restoration, maybe wild rice or cranberries. There's almost nothing, but it doesn't matter because the only consequence is if it isn't water dependent, which almost nothing is, the applicant just has to rebut 2 presumptions that the regulations say we're going to make. We're going to presume there's a site that isn't in a special aquatic site that's available that you could use, and that's less environmentally damaging than the one in the wetland, for instance. Makes sense? Whole point of alternatives analysis. So we're going to presume, we have to presume there's another place to do this and it's less environmentally damaging. So it's up to the applicant to rebut that. They're called the rebuttable presumptions. Also the name of our trivia team when we teach it after hours when we teach in Huntsville. Nobody knows what the rebuttable presumptions are. So don't spend a lot of time on water dependency, but it's good to know when you see it, like in the public notice or something, because we're supposed to say certain things in public notices, you know what that's getting at. Okay, so you've got your purpose, and you're going to come up with alternatives, but you have to compare. You have to screen those alternatives. How are you going to evaluate these various alternatives? You have to evaluate them against something, and the words we use are screening criteria. So think of an example. I won't even say a specific example, but something that's being proposed may need to have access to a rail corridor. They need to be able to build a spur, to connect to a rail corridor, or they need to be within reasonable proximity to some certain KV utility line or a trunk highway or something because of the business or what the thing is. They may need to have that in order to achieve the purpose. You can't just build anything literally anywhere. There's some constraints. So defining those screening criteria are important. That isn't actually on there as part of the alternatives analysis, but so identifying those is really key because then when you look at alternatives, and we may ask you to look at certain alternatives that seem obvious or come to mind that maybe weren't in an application to begin with, we're going to ask you what the screening criteria are. What do you have to have? And identify those things first. So alternatives then is kind of a big word, and it includes avoidance, minimization, and all that kind of stuff. So I'm trying not to get ahead of myself here. The word practicable is up there, and that's part of the word LEDPA, which is at the end. So let me go to the end real quick. Another reason we're doing this is because by regulation, we can only permit the least environmentally damaging practical alternative. We have no choice. If there's a less environmentally damaging way that's practicable, that's the only thing we can permit. If we don't get enough information to tell if the proposal submitted to us is the lead, but we have to deny it. There's no choice. The 404B1 guidelines are pass fail, like you pass it or you fail it. So it's, that's what we're working toward is the LEDPA. So that's why the word practicable is up there. Feasible and prudent for WACA. A lot of overlap there in what they mean. So alternatives encompasses offsite alternatives and onsite, what we call onsite configurations or avoidance and minimization. Offsite alternatives mean, is there another place that this could be that's available? And it's practicable, meaning it can be done, considering costs and logistics and technology and all that kind of stuff. So we compare all these different sites potentially against the screening criteria and against the purpose trying to be achieved. But then there's also on-site alternatives. We call on-site configurations. You avoid, you minimize, you change the shape, you move it over in the corner, you build a ramp instead of a lot, all that kind of minimization kind of stuff. You move things around, you use the uplands to the greatest extent you can. So that's kind of the alternatives part. And all that is what's being proposed, the least environmentally damaging, practicable way to achieve the project purpose. That's what we're getting to. The two Couple little quick things before I wrap this up is the least environmentally damaging part isn't just the lower number in acres. Well, and remember on the core side, it's wetlands, and rivers and streams and lakes. It's not just wetlands, it's all the aquatic resources that are waters of the US. It's not every single thing, but it's more than wetlands. So you may have one site that impacts 3 acres of wetlands, another site that impacts 1 acre of wetlands and 3,000 feet of stream. It's not a numeric calculation. You got to figure out which is least environmentally damaging. Or you could have 3 acres of high quality wetlands versus 5 acres of low quality wetlands. You know, there's some analysis to be done there. So, and then practicable doesn't mean most convenient. It doesn't mean least expensive. Those are factors. I mean, cost is a factor, but it isn't what's the least expensive. And I know that's the same. Dave's going to say that's the same for WACA too. So, okay, that's the basic framework. I'm going to stop there. I hope that was a logical stepping through why we have to know what the need is, have the know what the purpose is, define what's important, the screening criteria, the factors that we're going to weigh alternatives against, identify alternatives, offsite alternatives and onsite configurations, compare them to those criteria, figure out which ones are practicable, eliminate the alternatives that aren't practicable. And those that are, then start to compare the degree of environmental harm from each of them, which isn't always straightforward. It's not just the number of acres necessarily. And when we get to the conclusion, whether the proposal in the application is the LEDPA, we can permit that. Then we get into compensatory mitigation. Compensatory mitigation does not affect the LEDPA determination. That comes after. You can't say, well, it impacts more wetlands, but I'm going to buy mitigation, so it offsets it. So it really isn't impacting anything. There's a hard line. You have to come to the LEDPA conclusion before you get to mitigation. So anyway, I'll throw one thing in here and then I'll stop talking. The common misconception is during this alternatives analysis and looking at other sites, there could be another site nearby that the applicant doesn't own. So they don't want to go do that one. They want the one they already own, right? But it's less environmentally damaging and it's practicable. A lot of people think, well, you're going to make me go build over there. No, we can't do that. Regulations don't allow us to make anybody do anything. We just can't permit the one that's proposed. The way we can permit the one that's proposed is alter it so it's the LEDPA. If there's something else that's less environmentally damaging and practical, we can't permit this one. You have to reduce the impacts on this one to make it the LEDPA, then we can permit it. So if it isn't the LEDPA, we got to deny, but we can't force anybody to go somewhere else. So you just got to keep, refiguring the layout or whatever, make it the LEDPA. All right, stop there.
So before we go into the components, I do think it's important to put into context where the alternatives analysis fits within the rule itself. So I mentioned earlier that the alternatives analysis is within sequencing, right? It's within an overarching review standard that we call sequencing. But I think what's probably even more important, especially for consultants to understand, is that the alternatives analysis is actually within the avoidance portion of sequencing. So remember how, again, back to the purpose of WACA, right, to avoid impacts. Well, sequencing as a review standard has the avoidance, the minimization, rectify, restore, then the replacement, right? That's all in descending order. In fact, when you read the statute for wetland replacement, it's like 2 pages long. It's very concise, but what is there word for word is that descending order of avoidance, minimization, rectify, restore, and then replace unavoidable impacts. So it's important to understand, especially when you're walking into a review, preparing an application to be reviewed, that you understand that the alternatives analysis itself needs to be thought of as you're demonstrating avoidance. So those 2 alternatives that you're coming up with are avoidance alternatives, right? Of course, I know do nothing is an alternative, right? But there has to be built in an avoidance alternative. So it's really important to understand where you are in the context of the rule, and then understand too that the onus is on both sides. The applicant must demonstrate. The LGU must consider. Those are musts, right? It's not may, it's a must. So it's on both sides of the table as you're reviewing these applications that both parties have to come up with these avoidance alternatives. So I think that's a really important thing to understand where they fit in the context. Also too, if there is an avoidance alternative out there that exists, that is feasible and prudent, which we can talk about in a second here, the LGU must deny the replacement application. That's not a may, that's a must. So to me, that really emphasizes the importance of this review, of this part of the review. Remember, alternative analysis is just part of that avoidance. Once you've cleared the avoidance, once you've demonstrated that there are no feasible, prudent avoidance alternatives, that's when you can walk into the minimization. In fact, I would suggest that the most common mistake I see from even seasoned consultants is that they jump into minimization. They're using minimization as your argument to get through the process, when really the due diligence wasn't done on the avoidance side. It's in descending order. Demonstrate avoidance, then jump into minimization. So then to speak a little bit to the components of the alternatives analysis, Chad's spot on. The two programs are very similar in a lot of ways. We may use slightly different nomenclature for some of our terms, but that's about it. Our purpose and need is basically the same thing. That's where the applicant demonstrates by telling their story. What is our project? Be relatively specific in that these are the major components to this project. Here are some of the requirements, the standards, the key considerations that provide constraints for us to be able to achieve this project purpose. So that purpose and need is very valuable. If you're sitting around the table with your team trying to really think about one thing to be very strategic about when preparing an application, that's it. Clearly laying out your purpose and need is going to help you down the road. And it also helps kind of set the context for the regulators of how they're going to view this project. If you didn't mention one major component of your project and your purpose and need, there it is on the map with impacts. Well, that's low hanging fruit for the regulators to point and say, hey, that's not part of the purpose and need. What's that doing over there? That's impacting wetlands. So be very strategic, very clear about what that purpose and need is. The wetland dependency, yeah, Chad's right. This doesn't happen very often. It's literally when you walk into avoidance, when you read it in the rule, it's the first thing you see. The LGU must determine whether or not the project is wetland dependent. I've only encountered this thing once in my life. It was for a wild rice production. So again, it's there. You make a statement. Chances are you just move on from there. This idea of feasible and prudent is one that I know techs spend a lot of time talking about. And while the statute is relatively concise, this is one area of rule where the agency clearly took a fair amount of time to expand on, right? So we literally lay it out. For those of you who are, familiar with the rule, I think it's page 46, there's what is considered a feasible and prudent alternative. Now, keep in mind, if you're preparing an application, the LGU has to determine whether or not these are good faith alternatives that are being presented. So you don't necessarily need to go and walk through every single item on the list about what feasible and prudent is for each alternative, but you have to be hitting the high notes. Okay, so can it be done from an engineering perspective? Is it consistent with public health and humans and safety? Those sorts of things. Just make sure that you're hitting the high notes, that your alternative that you're presenting is meeting that feasible and prudent to be considered a good faith alternative. Now, we'll get into quite a bit more about avoidance and minimization. It's in descending order. I know I'm going to sound like a broken record by the end of this afternoon, but it is avoidance first, then minimization. When we're talking about alternatives and avoidance alternatives, you'll see it's in the case studies. That's where the first focus always is and always should be. The sequencing compliance then, so I'm going to skip over minimization because we'll get into the case studies. The idea about the sequencing compliance comes back to the LGU, right? The LGU must consider these alternatives. The LGU must consider these factors when walking through their minimization efforts. At the avoidance side of things, the LGU must deny the application if there's a reasonable alternative out there that's avoidance. On the minimization side of things, this is really where some of that back and forth goes between the LGU and the applicant, right? That's where the LGU is required to go through this list of criteria. Hopefully, because we have a really well-written project purpose, all the requirements of the project are really clearly laid out in that application, which we'll get into more detail about. But the applicant is considering all those, has those back and forth, really keyed into some of those minimization efforts that go in and making that compliant, that determination at the end of the day, that yes, this application, the way it's written, meets the avoidance and has minimized to the greatest extent possible. So a ton of similarities with the core. I think that for those of you who have been in the business long enough, you probably have noticed that very seldom the approved impact totals between WACA and the core permits are much different from each other. And I think that fact speaks volumes about how well aligned the two programs actually are.
Some really good points. Just for reference, we put together a slide where in the respective programs, you can find this information or these components of the alternatives analysis. So as Dave mentioned, there's a specific part of WACA rule where you can find all this. It's certainly not inclusive of everything that needs to be done. We want to just pull out the sections in there that were really relevant to what we're going over today. The Corps regs are a little more spread out, should we say. If you go through the Corps Department of the Army regulations, there's multiple sections in there, and you really got to tunnel into 33 CFR 325.1, which is processing of Department of the Army permits, where you find a lot of that information. But if you really want to get to the substantive standard for issuing permits, it's not in the Corps regs, it's in 40 CFR 230, which is the 404B1 guidelines. So that is specifically 230.10 is where all the nuts and bolts of the alternatives analysis is. So if you want to get in and understand that lead foot concept and how that's worked, you're going to go to the 404B1 guidelines. It's a little odd that the Corps permitting program, you can jump outside of the Corps regulations to find the real substantive standard, but that's how it works. And then the last reference down there, the 1502.14, anybody know what that is? No, that's NEPA. So there is in 325 in the core regs, there's an appendix B. Appendix B? Yeah, appendix B, which is how the Corps does EAs and NEPA documentation for the permit process. And that references the NEPA regs where you can find more information on doing NEPA alternatives analysis. But to be clear, a NEPA alternatives analysis may not satisfy a 404B1 determination. So they're not the same. They could end up being the same, but they're not always the same. So you need to be very careful if you're involved in preparation of a NEPA document for a project, that you can't just take that and drop it on your permit application and expect to get through the process. It may not work then. So you can comment on that, Chad, if you want to highlight anything else. But I think that's an important distinction.
That brings up a really good point that may be helpful to understand, especially if you're getting information requests, talking to a core project manager. There's way more going on than Clean Water Act 404B1 guidelines when it comes to our permit decision. We have what we call a combined decision document at the end, because a whole bunch of things rolled into one, and some of them overlap. NEPA's the obvious one. There's the Clean Water Act and the 404B1 guidelines, pass fail. Like I said, it's a yes or no, it's a deny, or not at the end. NEPA is procedural, whether it's an environmental assessment or an EIS. It's procedural. It never results in a yes, you can do a project, and no, you can't. It's an environmental analysis and public involvement. We're doing that at the same time. Those alternatives analyses aren't the same. One is procedural, one is substantive, pass fail. So they overlap a lot. And so we're kind of doing both of them. We also have to do a public interest review. There's 21 specific public interest factors we have to evaluate. We also have to comply with the Endangered Species Act, National Historic Preservation Act, our tribal consultation responsibilities, a slew of executive orders. And so there's a lot of stuff going on that project manager is thinking about and evaluating, and asking questions about of an applicant or consultant. So there's a lot more going on than just the stuff you find at those records, those citations there.
let's just go real quick so we can get to the case studies. This where, if you're submitting an application, where you find this on the joint app form. So the first reference is really in part 3 there, where it does talk about the project purpose and need. This is more of a general description of the project. So as we talked about it in sort of our meetings where we were putting this together, this is not necessarily the spot where you really want to get into your alternatives analysis and really highlight or present that purpose and need. This is probably enough to just be a general project description. And then when you get into attachment C, this is where you want to make sure that you're going through and providing all of those elements for that agency staff to go through and understand how you're putting together the demonstration of compliance with the sequencing requirements or the alternatives analysis under the course program. So to stop there, are there any questions thus far on things that we've covered? We're all on your way to being experts.
That all made sense. We could condense the day and a half it takes to do this in our core training to the 10 minutes that I
So,
did.
and just a couple of general points about replacement plan application. I think we're all familiar with the cover page telling us what parts are required, right? Parts 1 through 5 and attachments C and D. But I think another thing that is really important that is stated on the joint application itself is that pre-application consultations are strongly encouraged. That should be bold, italics, underlined, basically always done, in my opinion, especially for relatively large replacements or really projects of any size that are going that way. We should be talking to the LGU. TEPs, you'll be hard pressed to find a TEP that does not, would rather have a long drawn out discussion once an application has been drawn up, fighting over alternatives and minimization, than having a conversation beforehand before the application is even submitted. Reason being, a lot of times, is because a lot of these projects are coming at us, and we are not experts in many of the fields that we're being asked to weigh in on and review projects for. I'm not an engineer, and I'm a rock licking geologist. I don't know what kind of siding requirements are required for different, a rail project or a road project or whatever's happening. So I think it's really important, especially for consultants, that once you know you're walking down the road of a replacement plan, contact that LGU, give them a brief overview. You don't have to have a perfectly defined project purpose at that point, but tell them exactly what the applicant wants in the ideal outcome, and kind of what the constraints are, at least from your perspective. Understanding that there's a lot to flesh out there, but a pre-application consultation is probably the single biggest way that you could streamline a replacement plan review. So don't forget to do that, or just kind of make that a practice.
Underline bold.
Italics.
The most valuable time spent in any permit evaluation is before this permit application. I'm preaching to the choir here. Nothing more frustrating for everybody involved than for every single consideration to be figured out, and all the layers are all figured out. And the last thing is, well, what about the wetlands and throwing a permit application? So, okay, you need to back up about 40 steps. Why here, why this, on the whole alternatives analysis, you got to back all the way up. So being there at the beginning to explain some of the requirements or constraints or whatever, shape the development of the project and make it easy to put a top-notch permit application together, which just greases the skids. It goes so easy. This one was the last thing anybody thinks about is the wetland permit. It makes things really hard. And a whole bunch of engineers and everybody else are really frustrated because they've done all this work. And we're asking them, well, why this? Why not that? Why not that? So,
And
pre-apps.
And we of course could speak all day about the value of a good map, right? Value of a good impact map at that. But I think the key is that you're telling that story to us, starting from the first encounter, whether it's pre-application, consultation related. You're telling us the story. You probably have a lot more of that technical background than many of those tech members. So don't shy away from referencing technical standards, technical requirements, technical definitions, but do what you can to keep it in plain language. Be able to communicate to the TEP that, you know what, we're bound by this requirement. And without getting into the exact technical specs of that requirement, just give it in plain language. This is what we need. This is what we can't do because of this requirement. So a lot of this right here, the project purpose and need, and the narrative that you choose to write in attachment C is you telling the story with clearly laying out what your requirements are, what your constraints are, but do it in plain language as much as possible, because we're not experts in many of these fields.
That's a good segue to our first case study,
Got a
Dave.
question over there, Tim.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
At what point is an offsite alternatives analysis?
Great question. I'm gonna repeat that so everyone can hear. At what point is an offsite alternatives analysis required?
Yeah, is it a threshold? Is it?
Okay.
specific Quality or?
You go first.
I'll go first, sure. I'll say first that, in my view, the joint application is a little deceiving as far as WACA requirements go. Okay? And the reason why is because the LGU must consider offsite whether or not a site in the same general area could accomplish the project purpose. Right? That's right there, number one under avoidance. Okay? So that is a consideration that the LGU must consider. Now, what form that actually takes on an actual application is going to be project specific. So you're going to see in one of our case studies that there was a very robust offsite analysis done because this store had some geographic considerations. There was land out there that they knew that they should look into to decide where exactly the exact spot was for this project. That is a situation where an offsite analysis was very much part of the equation. If you're talking about mom and pop driveway going through a wetland, relatively small impact, that's a different story, right? Now, that part of the avoidance requirement for the LGU to consider does say that you need to consider whether or not, even on land that they may or may not own, right? It's not bound by whether they own it or not. But I think a lot of that call, that whether or not how robust that offset analysis is going to take, for WACA at least, is really going to be dependent on the project itself.
Yeah, the scrutiny that we give a project is commensurate with the degree of the impacts, what Dave said. There's one really nice, helpful boundary that we can use in the core program. You know, we create general permits. So there's individual permits, the regular old permit process, but then we create these general permits that are like, if you can get it down to that, with those small thresholds, you minimize impact down to that, we don't expect an alternatives analysis, an offsite alternatives analysis that you're asking about. Because those thresholds we've made small, usually half acre, less than half acre, something like that. So if something qualifies for a general permit, core side, we don't expect an offsite alternatives analysis. If it does require an individual permit, a little more than a GP, then it depends. Maybe it's barely more than a GP, 0.6 of an acre. That's going to be a very different kind of requirement than 6 acres of impact, for instance. So the scrutiny really is commensurate with the degree of impact and the impact to what, not just acres, but to quality and sort of thing. Yeah.
Another key verbiage that's in that part of the rule too, that I think is worth pointing out, is that when we're talking about land that's not owned by the applicant itself, it's whether that land could be reasonably obtained is the rule language. And I think, yes, that's a judgment call on the LGU's part, but I think that's a big factor in that decision.
Thought I saw another hand up. So one more question, then we're gonna move into the case studies. Go ahead.
You talked about having the pre-application meeting. Is there like a lower threshold where the Corps really doesn't want to be involved in some of those pre-app meetings, or do you want to be involved in everything?
So the question was, is there a threshold below which the Corps doesn't need to be involved in a pre-application meeting?
We understand that you have a lot of things coming in.
Yeah, we don't want to have 3,000 pre-application meetings unnecessarily every year. So what came to mind was, if it's eligible for a general permit, it's not that simple, but I would say most things eligible for a general permit are less likely to benefit. So it's less important to have a pre-application. If it needs an IP, for sure. If it needs an individual permit, hands down, have a pre-app meeting. Maybe it's easy and straightforward and it's a quick pre-app meeting and there's nothing really to talk about. But there's some GPs that avoidance minimization, you know, maybe there's some key sticky points there that matter, you know. There's a lot of subdivisions, it seems like, that are eligible for GPs, but there's a lot of sticky issues with them. So there's, I don't want to say it's a, you know, bright line, but a lot less likely that it's needed for a GP versus an IP. I'd say always for an IP, at least have a meeting. Yeah.
And for WACA, that pre-app meeting might just be a simple phone call to LGU. Hey, they're gonna punch this driveway through here. Just take a look at the land explorer, tell me what you think, or even the game here. But then, of course, that becomes much more complicated when we're talking about a subdivision or some of the complicated projects we're encountering now. Think about all the solar installation projects that we're all wrestling with. Well, those are very difficult impact determinations, just to get land on the impact sometimes. So I think it all these kind of depends on the nature of it, of the project itself, and whether or not that's just a quick phone call with the LGU or asking for a full TEP meeting is just really going to depend on the nature of the project itself.
Quick follow-up on that, is the applicant signature required for a pre-app?
So a pre-app is generally before the application's even in. Right? So when I say pre-application consultation, I'm talking about typically a project where there's a concept plan, but there's no application actually written at that plan. So a lot of times, at least in the pre-application meetings that I see, it's a map with the delineation with preliminary design on it.
So that would be a no.
That'd be a no. Thank you.
All right, I'm gonna take this first case study, and try to move through it real quick, because it's an illustration of concept, of not using a concept that Dave talked about, which is telling your story. An alternatives analysis is you telling the story so the regulator understands all the facets of the project so they can make a decision. If you don't tell the story, they will ask you for the story, and it will get into this back and forth. So this was a project that I was the regulatory project manager for back in, I don't even know what year, 2005, 2006. It was a power plant, coal-fired power plant expansion at an existing facility down south of Milwaukee, along Lake Michigan there. So We Energies was the applicant. They had a facility there. They've got coal storage areas and rail and water intakes for cooling water and all kinds of stuff. And they wanted to add, let's see, if I move my cursor, is that that's not gonna show up on there, is it? Just to the north, they're sort of up coast there. They wanted to add additional generating units. So when I came into the project, they had already done their work with the Public Utilities Commission in Wisconsin and received an approval. And they dropped their alternatives analysis on us and said, here you go, run with it. Well, it wasn't bad, but it didn't answer our questions that we need to answer for the program. So we went through a 6 to 12 month process of defining the story or telling the story. And they just couldn't figure out how to tell the story. And I'll give a few examples. I went into the project and looking at the configuration, and immediately my thought was, yeah, obviously putting the next generating unit at this site is probably going to be the best option for them for various reasons. But I had to check that because I can't just jump to that conclusion. They need to demonstrate it to me and I have to be able to work through the process. But a lot of regulators will look at projects and get an idea in their head right away. This is probably permittable, or this is likely not going to be permittable. There are certainly projects that have that odor when they come in that they're not going to get permitted. But I sat down with them and said, okay, you guys just selected and got approved by the PUC to build the generating stations just to the north on the existing facility. How did you make a decision that was the best spot? And I remember being in the meeting room, there was this uncomfortable pause. Well, it's a no-brainer, Tim. It's right next to where we already have our facility. That's not good enough. So why couldn't you do it somewhere else? Well, because it's right next to our facility. So we had this drug out discussion. And I actually had to get to the point where Chad mentioned the, the screening criteria. I call them planning constraints, but the factors that help them make a decision. And I can't believe that for a $2 billion project, they didn't have all this siting criteria and all these things that they looked at. But I had to pull it out piece by piece so that they were able to tell their story. And I had to do things like, okay, so you have a power plant, and we took this approach because it was a highly controversial project and there was opposition to it. And we had standing FOIA requests to get all of our information on a monthly basis. So we had to be very careful with how much we coached them to get an answer. But we had meetings where I had to pull out of them. So what do you need in order to have a plant? What are your screening criteria? Again, uncomfortable pause. I said, well, maybe you need something to burn at your plant. Well, yeah, we need coal. I said, okay, so you need to be able to get coal into this facility. Well, yeah. I'm like, okay. See where I'm going with this? I said, what else might you need? Uncomfortable pause. I said, do you need cooling water for your thing? Well, yeah, we gotta have cooling water. I mean, that's why we're right there right now. I'm like, okay, so maybe that sort of defines sites that are gonna work for you and not work for you. And then maybe you need access to the power grid in order to deliver the actual electricity to your customers. So we went through this extended process because by the time they engaged their consultant for the 404 permit, they'd already done this PUC process and had an approved project. So they just came in and said, we want you to approve this. We had to backtrack all the way. And I kid you not, they claimed they had no records from the internal meetings that they had where they decided this was the best site. And they looked at 30 some other sites. We finally got on. Said, well, how did you eliminate those sites? Well, they just weren't good sites. Based on what? I mean, we went back and forth, like I said, for 6 to 12 months. So it's kind of an illustration. I think I put on here that the issue was, and this is going to show up, well, this is from the Wisconsin wetland inventory, but they had wetlands along the block, these seep wetlands along the block that were a big deal. And that's why we really wanted to make sure that we had this project laid out. I mean, it ended up impacting, I think, 15 to 20 acres of wetland, a whole bunch of the Lake Michigan shoreline. They had a 20-foot diameter, mile-long intake pipe out into the lake for cooling water. So it was a big deal. But they ended up building it. You can see the facility just to the north there was a new plant. But the point is, tell your story. And if you as a consultant get asked to put a permit application together and you're brought in and you don't know how they got to the site that they're handing you, you need to ask them to go back and help you fill in the blanks on that to get to the point where you can put an alternatives analysis together that really answers those questions or lays out that process.
So what would have like declined this project? Is there anything that would have ever made it be a no?
Actually, there was there were a lot of issues, not necessarily with the wetland issue was significant because you can't mitigate those coastal seep wetlands. There's just so few of them left. So that was a big deal. The main issue were the impacts to Lake Michigan from the intake, because if you follow anything in Lake Michigan, the yellow perch population has crashed, and I can't remember the little food source that they have, but the state of Wisconsin was really hung up on that. And there was actually an EPA scientist who was submitting comments through our public notice process about how detrimental to the lake this would be, and this, that, and the other. And so there were some things that were really evaluated on this, but we ended up going ahead and issuing the permit anyway. So there were some things that in the public interest review really rose to a certain level of scrutiny, but ultimately the decision was to issue the permit.
And that whole back and forth and like Tim leading that applicant or that consultant through the process, making them back up to when they had 30 sites they were considering and then tell the story, that could feel to an applicant like where the regulations are trying to stop the thing from happening. And the thing I try to remind everybody, we as a regulatory program have the exact same objective as any applicant, and that's a defensible permit decision. Because if it's not defensible, we cut corners, we jump to, Tim said, yeah, this is probably permittable, but we got to get through the process. If it just issued a permit without doing all the things that were necessary, we'd lose in court and the project would be hung up in litigation for years, and then everybody loses. So a defensible decision that adhered to the process and has the information needed, that's what everybody wants. Otherwise, it's going to be hung up. And read the news, you can think of lots of examples where that happens. So people are not afraid to litigate. decisions they don't like. So our defensibility comes from following the process and answering all the questions. We get deference from the courts. Where there's judgment involved on our part, we get zero deference when we deviate from our process and don't follow the requirements. So same objective, just get the information that support a good decision.
I mean, in my mind, that just underscores that importance of clearly laying out the planning constraints, your requirements. Think about an LGU who may get 1 or 2 replacement plan applications a year, and all of a sudden that thing is smacked down on their desk. That's gonna be a difficult one, right? And that inherently is a part of WACA with the local administration. That can be difficult sometimes, right? So I think that a project like that, that's so large in scope and complexity, really speaks to why it's so important to lay out your requirements, to have that story clearly told right away at the beginning. So you don't have to spend the 12 months or whatever Tim had to do coaching the planning team along to get to an application.
Why don't you follow that thought and walk us through the next one, Dave?
Sure.
This is one that you're very familiar with.
And not as familiar with others as others in the room, in fact. This is one that we use, those of you who've done MWPCP courses have seen this example before. This is the Costco in Woodbury. And what this project really exemplifies in my mind is how relatively developed area and a relatively large project, just in the site requirements, the spatial requirements of the project, can go through the WACA sequencing process and basically hit every note and be approvable, even though there are considerable spatial requirements and it was a relatively developed area. So the Costco team put together this very robust offsite alternatives. They had a geographic constraint that they knew the market that they had to hit. They knew the corridors, right? The freeway corridors that they wanted to be within. Then for those of you who have gone to a Costco in the last decade, you know they're all very typical, right? They have their typical store size, parking, gas station. They have their idea of what the plan is, and they have the reasons why that's the store that they need to build. So recognizing this application kind of preempted a lot of those questions that they were going to guess was going to happen or were going to come by doing a very robust offsite alternatives analysis along this geographic area that they were looking at doing. Can't read the notes, but on the side there, it's, what is it, 15 or 16 sites that they had looked at. And they give the number one, the big reasons why they weren't able to do it. Zoning, infrastructure, freeway access. Those sorts of very legit reasons were why they X'd that alternative out as a feasible site.
So they had very clear screening criteria where they were able to eliminate sites and document why.
They were able to very well articulate, this is what we need, why we need it, and these sites, for these reasons, don't meet that purpose. So one, their avoidance in their alternatives and then their offsite analysis was really robust and well received, right? So they landed on their site. So when they got to their site itself, this map is kind of difficult to read. The majority of the wetlands are up there on the top left, right? There's a little stream going through it as well. So relatively sensitive aquatic resource. So their first alternative that they were looking at was this right here with relatively large impact. I believe that was just south of 2 acres of impact. So about 70,000 feet of impact, something along those lines. That's obviously a pretty large impact, right? Accomplishes their project purpose. Pretty big impact. So this is their avoidance alternative. Their avoidance alternative pushed it out of the resource, but they weren't. Now they're store had shifted alignment, so it's facing the wrong side. And they were getting constrained on their parking spaces. So again, they had clearly laid out in their project purpose the fact that they needed this much parking space. They also were gonna have, there's a gas station too, right? But then they also are gonna need in the back of the store for the deliveries, they know that they would need certain radius for trucks to turn, and they had different spatial requirements, standards that they had to meet in the back of the store as well, that were defining, were constraining their project. So for those reasons, this avoidance alternative was crossed out. They were able to defend that though. So this is ultimately where they landed. Now, with this, they were able, obviously, to fulfill their project purpose, right? There are still a fair amount of wetland impacts there. You can see that it's 49,000, so they're just north of an acre of impacts, which is a pretty big impact, right? Especially in the metro. A couple things though that were done. One, notice how they shifted the store down, right? And also two, notice that nice crisp line of the wetland impact to the top left of the store. Well, to stay out of that sensitive resource, that stream back there, they built a retaining wall. So once they got past doing their offsite analysis, demonstrating why their avoidance alternative wasn't going to work, they set forth some pretty decent minimization efforts, especially building that retaining wall, which, you know, I don't know, that's a pretty tall wall. Remind me how tall it is? It's like 15, 20 feet tall, right? So do the math on end slopes of that wall and how much more impact that would have happened. So they went, built the retaining wall, got rid of those additional impacts that they would have needed for the side slope, and were able to minimize their impacts by a great deal.
Anything to add, Chad? No? Okay.
Anything to add on people who actually were part of that review team? Because I wasn't. All right.
I will add one thing. I remember when the poor project manager worked on this, I said, hurry up and permit that, because this will now be the closest Costco to my house. It is where I go all the time. Matter of fact, I'll be getting softener salt there on my way home tonight.
Okay, the next case study, we wanted to cover sort of the nuances between transportation projects, because that is frequently encountered here in Minnesota, and there are some differences in terms of approach for linear transportation projects. So for this one, for an existing road improvement, assume and wipe from your mind that the road program exists. So we'll comment on that later, but it makes things really complicated. So for the time being, just assume that there is no local government road wetland replacement program. So real quick, I'm just going to read kind of a narrative for this. Put my eyes on. And this is kind of a description of the project. I'm sorry, there's not a better graphic. It was hard to fit everything on and pull it off of a website. The applicant proposes to make improvements to a road that would provide additional capacity, improve safety, and better facilitate movement of motor vehicles at intersections and entrances in the project corridor, which is outlined in yellow there. The proposed improvements include creation of a southbound right turn lane, expansion of the road to the south to 4 lanes, creating additional travel lane in both directions, adding a paved and graded shoulder and sidewalk on both sides of the roadway, and creation, expansion, relocation of stormwater management facilities and associated infrastructure. The project corridor is approximately 4,500 linear feet long along these existing roadways, and will result in a permanent loss of 1.47 acres of wetland. So I'll toss it to you, Chad, first to just, if you want to provide some comments on this and how you would see an alternatives analysis structured for a project like this. And well, I'll just leave it at that for now and ask follow-up questions.
So linear projects are their own unique kind of animal anyway, whether it's transportation or utilities. So it's another factor in the value of a pre-app if it's linear, even if it's eligible for general permit, there's often complications with some of these, or things that are worth talking about early. But something like this, the way Tim described it is changing something that's already there. So an offsite alternatives analysis isn't going to be in the cards, right? I mean, the greater the impacts, the more likely we would say, so this is where purpose matters. If the purpose is to reduce congestion and therefore increase safety and all that, are there other ways? Is it to get from here to here? Are there other roads that could be improved rather than this one? The way Tim described it, this has some very specific things to be done that need to be done here that couldn't be accomplished by, improving congestion some other place. But the bigger the impacts, the bigger the project, the more likely there's other ways to achieve that purpose, which is usually somehow safety related, congestion related. But for this one, it's really going to be more about avoidance and minimization. And you mentioned sidewalks. Dave mentioned earlier, multiple purposes, that matters. Sometimes it's like, we're going to have a trail go through here, we're going to extend this trail that stops. Well, that's a different purpose than the road. So, we got to remember all those kind of things, but things like this are really the focus is going to be on avoidance and minimization. And one of the most common questions that we have to deal with that we have to ask is about stormwater management. And stormwater ponds are easiest to build at the lowest point in the landscape, right? What's always in the lowest point of the landscape? The wetland. So, but there's been a lot of success and a lot of innovation and ingenuity in ways to manage stormwater that don't require a big pond on the ground. I mean, there's all kinds of different techniques nowadays. So again, small impacts, not as much scrutiny. Big pond and a nice big quality wetland, probably gonna, look at some other alternatives to treating that. So those are the things that kind of come to mind for this project for me. We'll come to your mind.
I mean, so for one, again, big work aside, right? We're talking replacement plan for this. So it's an existing infrastructure project. So first thing's one alternative, right? Requirement under rule. The other thing that comes into my mind is this is why it's really important for you to clearly lay out your requirements, your constraints. So what is the traffic count that is bringing you to this conclusion that you need that extra lane? Is that trail connecting something else on a network? Or is this just kind of a trail going out to nothing? What are those side slope requirements that you need for both that road and that trail? Things such as on the water side, yeah, I want to see the rationale. Why you landed on that basin right there. Had a really good project review on the North Shore last year where they showed us their model of, they dropped water and had it flow down and said, this is what it's going to look like. This is why we need that infrastructure right there. It made sense. We are near a really good resource with Lake Superior being right next door. It made total sense why they were asking for those impacts. So this is where it's really important for you to lay out what your requirements are and your rationale behind it, what your constraints are. The other thing too that I see oftentimes is when they repair or rehabilitate existing infrastructure, it's often the time that those engineers say, hey, let's fix wrong from a past wrong, right? Think about, oh, we totally missed the boat on, that was an undersized culvert. We want to repair that. We want to replace that culvert with something larger. It's going to lead to this much more impact. Give us the reason. Lay it out. Okay, we've done our modeling. This is the diameter culvert we need. This is the standards we're going to need for those end slopes. That's how we got to our conclusion. See that quite a bit with repair of existing roads. So don't forget that angle as well.
Any questions on this one? Very common project to see from a regulatory standpoint. Nothing, anything online? No. So in 30 seconds, Dave, explain why we took the road program out of this one. Can you do it in 30 seconds?
No.
No?
So I think most of you guys are familiar with this, is that the local government road wetland replacement program, right? Legal work, which is, by the way, if anybody's got that T-shirt, I want it. Legal work is for replacing impacts for projects that repair, rehabilitate project or existing infrastructure, right? So that's not a replacement plan. Right? That's separate. So that's why we want to make that distinction for WACA. That oftentimes just simply repairing, as long as the project qualifies for the program, it's a whole nother conversation. We wouldn't be talking replacement. How was that?
That was really good.
Okay.
I didn't listen to it, but you stopped. Well done. Thank you.
35 seconds.
It has no bearing on the Clean Water Act permit.
Right.
All right, so let's go to something a little bit more complicated. A little bit more of a robust review, a new road alignment. Believe it or not, we actually had to go outside. It was hard to find one of these. These are not that common anymore. No comments, Ben Meyer. Ben and I have been talking about a new road construction project, so we'll see if that happens. But, for this one, this is actually down in Virginia, and, here is their proposed alignment. I just wanted to show you that because it's a little bit hard to pick up the actual road alignment when I show some of the other ones. There's a project corridor. You can see it crosses a water body and it crosses some areas of wetland. Here's an air photograph that also shows that project area. Let me read you sort of a brief description, and then we'll have Dave, comment on this initially. So the proposed project includes construction of a new 1.2 mile, 2-lane access road and bridge with a shared use path for bikers and pedestrians over the Oxbow River. The applicant's stated purpose is to provide access to the, I think it's Henricus Park, when the existing park access road is closed to accommodate closure of coal ash ponds at a power station. So over on the left side of the figure, that there's an access road to get to this park that will be lost when they remove this energy generating facility, and they have to have a new way to access that. So the proposed project will permanently impact 1.27 acres of wetland, half an acre of riverbed, and it'll convert about 6/10 of an acre of forested wetlands and about 1/10 of an acre of forested wetlands to 6/10 of forested wetlands to shrub, and then just about 1/10 from forested to emergent wetlands. So it looks like they're gonna have to manage some of the vegetation in there when they get the new road constructed. So go ahead, Dave.
So my first reaction to this when Tim showed this was, okay, this is a point where we really need to lay out what the purpose of this project is. There's actually quite a bit going on here. Apart from that facility being decommissioned, access to that park, crossing a river, there looks to be like a boat launch up there, a little finger going up there. You've got this open water wetland that, you know, the expanded area of interest there. Clearly connecting to the road with the bridge, another bridge going over the river. And also too, notice there's this street, this residential street that is part of the project area. So there's a lot of components to the project. There's a lot of consideration for that, I'm sure. A lot of requirements that tail on to those components of the project. So this is one, first clearly lay out that project purpose in all of its components. The other aspect too, that I think kind of jumping ahead in the sequencing, but it's the minimization end of things, is that I would guess that there's also some pretty high quality, high functioning wetlands and aquatic resources on that map right there. And I think that's really important to note. Our goal is to manage the water resources, right? We're reviewing this is our review standard for the impacts, but our whole goal at the end of the day is to manage the wetlands as responsibly as we can, manage the aquatic resources as best we can. So what I would suggest, if you are encountering a project like this for a new road that's got a lot going on and some high quality stuff around it, that we put some effort on the forefront to identify where there's clearly some high quality wetlands that should just straight up be avoided. If they're out there, those are where you avoid. And if there are areas that may have indirect impacts in the future, that's where we really want to be looking very closely at our design and making sure that we can avoid long-term indirect impacts as well. So to me, what jumps out more so than maybe the avoidance side of it is more so there's a lot going on, layout requirements, and let's really take a hard look at the quality of the resources that we're talking about.
What Dave said. I mean,
You want to leave it at that?
a new corridor, I mean, it's just gonna require a lot more robust alternatives analysis because there's just so many different ways to achieve it, probably, depending on the constraints, you know, identifying the purpose and the constraints and all that are really key. As far as the likelihood of approval, it's a good place to say this. We're gonna be straight with you. We can't be pre-decisional when we get an application or have a pre-app meeting and go, oh yeah, we can permit that, or no, we can never permit that. We're not gonna say that. We're gonna be straight with you and say, other things like this have had a really hard time getting a permit, or you're gonna need, the best alternatives analysis you've ever done, kind of thing. Like the bar is high for this. High quality wetlands, lot going on. It's navigable water most likely. And remember, we have more than Clean Water Act, Rivers and Harbors Act too, a whole nother regulation to comply with. So, we're gonna, we're not gonna pretend all things are equal when they're not. So we'll give you that feedback. Another advantage, huge advantage to a pre-app meeting. We give you some of that. Gotta tell you what to expect right up front.
Yeah, I think I would add to this, that this is a good example of one where, and I think you guys will both agree with me, the regulators are not road builders. So if there are, and I'm guessing this area probably has some very complicated engineering components to it to put a bridge in this area. I mean, you're in an old oxbow and there's a lot of wetlands. So there's gonna be some engineering constraints that are factored in this project. Those should be part of your application. You need to explain why you're doing things the way you're doing, because these folks aren't gonna understand it. Their first vision is gonna be looking at the impacts to the resources. You're gonna have to explain to them why that is situated the way it is. And that's often left out of a lot of the applications. And don't take for granted that these guys know how to construct roads or how the spacing on pilings for a bridge or the turn radius going into a bridge, stuff like that. That's not common knowledge amongst regulators, so you're gonna have to educate.
But we're gonna know enough to say, that looks navigable. What kind of navigation happens here? Do sailboats go up and down there? How high does this bridge have to be? What does that do to your approaches if your wetland fills? That kind of stuff. We're good at asking questions. Because we know somebody knows the answers to these things.
Good point. Good point. Any questions on this one? Yes.
So this is a historical park. Say that there are cultural resources or something found here. A lot of these resources aren't built in wetlands, they're either on fringes or near aquatic resources. So like, you're doing your lead bug consideration and we're looking at the wetland component, the aquatic resource component. How far afield, do you look at other these considerations under NEPA to be able to issue your decision, but maybe their concerns get mitigated, or how do you balance this?
So in an effort to repeat that question, tell me if I get this, is this right? All right, so you're talking about the cultural resource component of this, right? And how far do we look outside basically the wetland impact, right?
Yeah.
Is that a fair?
Where does the 404B1 and the NEPA process, like how do they talk to each other in a scenario where you have conflicting concerns?
Okay, they don't necessarily conflict. So we have 4 different, what we call scopes. NEPA would be less involved in this one, even if it's procedural. The one that matters is National Historic Preservation Act, which we have to comply with, section 106. That would force us to define the permit area of this. And that's a whole nother outreach event to talk about that. But there is an area of potential effect, basically, that we look at, that we determine based on a whole different set of factors to determine how we look at cultural resources. Another one is NEPA, another one is Endangered Species Act, a whole different way of identifying how far do we look beyond the wetland impact to see if there's effects to endangered species. So unfortunately, can't go into a lot of detail here today, so we don't have time, but I'm really glad you pointed it out. I mentioned all these other laws we have to make sure that are complied with before we can issue a permit. Those are some big ones, and cultural resources are big. Cultural resources is sometimes the thing that ties everything up and makes the permit take a long time, with archaeological surveys, tribal consultation, all kinds of stuff. So, but it isn't everywhere. It isn't limitless. It does have to be tied to our federal action, which is a permit.
I did some research on this site when I was putting this together. They will have significant 106 issues with this project, for sure.
Well, it's Virginia for one thing.
Yeah.
They always do everywhere.
These are some of the original, this area is some of the original settlements in Virginia, so there was plenty of work to do. We have a hard stop at 4 o'clock. No? Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to our last slide, just kind of a summary first, and then peel back, because I think the subdivision one is always interesting. And we'll skip the sort of the utility one. So let me just go. So if anybody's gonna bow out here, just in terms of the takeaway messages, we've said this many times, we had a case study, tell your story. And if you're coming in mid-story, you need to have your applicant walk back with you and give you the information so you can tell the story. Don't assume your audience knows your story. You have to make sure that you're telling it in a way, I think Dave used plain language, in a way that a uninformed third-party reviewer can understand it. We're not all engineers, we're not road builders, or we don't design Costco's and do all that stuff. So understanding that that is the audience and that you really need to lay everything out is a great idea. The clearly defining your screening criteria, constraints, limitations. That wasn't included on that slide where we went over the elements, and I did that purposely because you don't find anything about screening limitations or screening criteria or any of this stuff in the regs. But it is so important from a practicability standpoint to say, here's what I can and can't do, mostly what you can't do. The things that your project's not gonna work because those are the things you have to include in there. Very important. That means that you'll come back to it if you don't include it. You're gonna be asked, why can't you do this? Why can't you do this? Why can't you do this? If you lay those out clearly, it helps put some bounds on what your alternatives analysis is. And then address each element, the alternatives analysis in a logical and organized manner. So there is that appendix or attachment C to the joint app form. I always tell people, don't try to ram all your stuff in on the form. If it's clearer for you, create a separate document, put your own headings on there, use that attachment C as a reference for what you need in there, but put your own story together. Because you may have, like Dave talked about, there's the avoidance and the minimization, but you may have an offsite discussion, and when you get on site, you may do avoidance and minimization again, because like we talked about with the Costco example. You're gonna do that, it's kind of an iterative process, and you may revisit some of these things. So kind of go offsite, onsite, avoidance minimization, all your screening criteria, put it together how you think you best illustrate the process that you went through to arrive at your project. So it's kind of our summary points. If you guys have anything to add, throw it out. Otherwise, I want to jump back and we'll go a little bit longer on the subdivision one, because I liked our reactions to that when I first gave it to you guys. Go ahead.
One thing just on what you just talked about, Dave, what was the word you used when you said something effective? You didn't do like a genuine alternatives analysis, but it wasn't the word genuine.
Good faith effort.
Good faith effort. There you go. I like that. It's so obvious when that wasn't done. Those of you that are consultants, I'm sure I've had a client at some point that said, I want what I want, put on paper, whatever it's going to take to get the permit. It is so obvious when the alternatives analysis is just reverse engineered to try to support the desired outcome. It's obvious to us. It's like, it really needs to be a good faith effort. It needs to be a real off-site, on-site alternatives analysis. So it just wastes time when it's just kind of something random, tell me what I need to write down,
And I guess I just want to emphasize how critical of a step alternatives analysis and sequencing is in the Wetland Conservation Act and the wetland management in Minnesota. It's the ultimate check on the impact side of the whole equation. Spend all this time talking about mitigation, trying to figure out if, these smaller impacts under de minimis qualify for exemptions and such. But really, a lot of the bigger impacts are being permitted through replacement plans. And this is the review standard. This is where our emphasis should be, where we take the most time to not just demonstrate it, but also to review that the plans are actually applying with sequencing. So don't downplay this. Familiarize yourself with the rule. This is a good part of the rule to clip out because it actually is written out by the agency to be implemented. So familiarize yourself when you're preparing an application, walk through the rule itself and hit those points. And that will go a long ways for the reviewers.
Are there any questions or anybody have any questions in here on anything we've covered so far? Yes, go ahead.
You discussed sequencing flexibility and how that the process.
Sure. So, it's part 7. Right? Yes.
The question was, can we go over sequencing flexibility?
Yes, thank you. Yep. So sequencing flexibility is a part of the very end of sequencing, right? Well, not the last one, but it's part 7. So after you've gone through these parts that you basically need to demonstrate that you have a degraded wetland. And that if you could demonstrate that you have a degraded wetland and the replacement value of other wetlands are greater value than what you're talking about being impacted right now, there's a room in the rule for flexibility in sequencing, how we review the sequencing standards. Because that wetland has been demonstrated to be degraded to a point where there would be there's more value in the replacement wetlands themselves. Jed?
Second part of that, so part B.
Jed, why don't you step up here a little bit more?
What?
Step up here because if you're gonna get verbose, I don't want to repeat it, so come on, so,
The microphone's over here.
so the owl can pick you up.
Can it pick me up from over here?
No, you need to come
No.
forward.
Like I'm on the prices, right?
It's a very good point.
All right.
Jed Chestnut, come on down.
Yes. Thanks. You're the next contestant.
You'll never speak up at one of these again.
If you are applying for that. Number one, it's to the discretion of the LGU, whether or not they allow it. But the second part is it still requires an alternatives analysis. I see so many times in an application or requesting sequencing flexibility and they quote the rule, but they forget subpart B that says you still must do your alternatives analysis. It's still required. So I just wanted to add that.
Absolutely. It doesn't say, nope, there's no alternatives analysis here. It just simply laying out that first you got to demonstrate it, and then you still got to reconsider it. And to the LGU's discretion, they can utilize that.
There's no corollary in the Clean Water Act to that, but because the mitigation is always going to be better than any impaired wetland, right? I mean, it would apply all the time. If you looked at it that inappropriately simply, right? Because we only allow great mitigation, we only approve great mitigation. So, but there's flexibility in that. Again, it's the scrutiny that we give something is based on the degree of environmental harm, and quality plays into that in our minds. It's subjective, but we're not pretending every wetland's the same and it's all high quality. If there's junk wetland out there, we're not going to look at it the same as the same number of acres of high quality wetland. So there's some flexibility that way. It isn't written into a rule or anything, and it doesn't allow us to consider mitigation and make a decision. But we're also not blind to the very different qualities of wetlands out there. There is flexibility for small landowners, mom and pops, even some small businesses for really small acreages. Even if they need an IP, there's some flexibility in the regulatory guidance letter we have that allows us to, be more flexible when it comes to alternatives and how strictly we look at the lead requirement. So.
Okay, so we're at 4:03. Does anybody want us to cover? We have two other case studies. We could keep going. I'm assuming you guys are okay.
I thought we talked at 4:30, so I'm good.
Is it 4 or 4:30?
I don't know. Just keep,
It's right now.
but feel free to leave. if you-
Yes, if you do not want to listen or you have to go or you're not interested, fine. I think we're going to go ahead and cover this because I think the next one, the subdivision or residential development is one we see frequently. And it's also one of the more, for lack of a better word, contentious because there's so many ways to configure these and the agencies certainly have their view on how you can do avoidance and minimization with these and developers have their own view as well. So we thought we'd throw one of these in here and try and spark some discussion about it. This is actually one that's in the review process. I think I grabbed this from Oregon. So this is the project location. So there is some development in the area, but it's a vacant parcel. Looks like it might have been used for agricultural purpose at one time. It looks like it's been fallow for a while. So it's sitting here, it's alongside what appears to be a fairly major transportation corridor there. The wetland delineation showed that there's a few wetlands out there. I think it says 20 some acres of wetlands. So all the shaded or hashed areas are wetland. And then the proposed development, it's going to be turned a little bit, so it'll look a little bit different, but here's what they had proposed in terms of the development. So let me just read you real quick, sort of the summary. Let's see, the proposed project would fill 16.64 acres of wetland to construct a development with approximately 440 multifamily residential units on 22 acres of a 40-acre site. Permanent impacts to the wetland would be from the development. buildings and parking, stormwater facilities, new roads, and elevated boardwalks. Total permanent impact for the area, the total permanent impact area for the proposed development, I already mentioned, that's 16 acres. Let's see, they give all the cubic yardages. The applicant proposes to avoid minimize impacts from the project by locating development in uplands and wetlands along the west side of the parcel, implementing stormwater treatment and avoiding 12.5 acres of wetland along the eastern side of the parcel to maintain hydrology and habitat in those unimpacted wetlands. So they're, it sounds like they're kind of offering up the east side, which is this area towards the bottom of the slide, and those, it looks like they're lots, those are boardwalks that would extend. So you can walk from the highway back into the residential development at any number of points that you feel is convenient to get to your house. It's kind of an odd way of doing it. But anyway, when I threw this out here, the reactions from these two were kind of interesting. So I'll Chad, you can.
I said, we'll be straight with you at a pre-app meeting. This would be one of those, like, are you sure this is a good spot for this? They're almost 30 acres of fill. Yeah, you're proposing to avoid 12, but 30 acres of fill for a project that size would be, there's a high bar. That's, I mean, I don't know this area. I don't work in Oregon, but yeah, that's a big impact.
My first reaction is this is classic trying to fit too much on too little.
Yeah.
And, I think the reality is that we're at a point where this is pretty common, actually. The high ground's been developed. We're going into the subprime land now. That's it. It's very real housing needs. So developers are throwing these at us more and more. I think for reviewers, it's really kind of important to step back and just kind of blur your vision and look at this and see how much wetland impact you're actually talking about. And really then diving into some of the details and getting critical about it. Like, for example, how many new units do you actually need here? You gotta lay that out. Yeah, very clearly define why you need this many units. And remember, economic considerations alone don't rule out an alternative. From there, you gotta get down to the details about the actual configuration of some of those structures, like in the roads. So what kind of zoning constraints are under there? Has this been platted? Where are we in that review? What efforts have you made to remove those zoning constraints? So by asking those first questions, how many units do you actually need? Well, that might change the look of that map. Then starting some of the bigger questions about, okay, what are zoning constraints? What can we do to reconfigure some of these structures, put them a little tighter to those lines, that sort of thing? Well, that could change the map. And from there, I mean, you're just kind of, sometimes the consultants are right about accusing us of getting nitpicky about some of these configurations of these lots. But the fact of the matter is, we got how many units that are being proposed to be constructed entirely in wetlands? That should raise a lot of questions. Automatic. And so I think it's a project like this, unfortunately, isn't that abnormal for residential developments. But I think having that pre-application meeting, having those big questions being answered before you even get to an application are going to save people a lot of struggles down the road. And by the way, I mean, I love boardwalks, but you don't need a boardwalk at every single end of the street. Okay? So I think there's just more questions than anything on this one that I think should be answered way before you get into the actual application itself.
This is kind of an extreme example, but it's very common to have discussions about the number of lots. Someone developer landowner wants 200 lots. We say, well, if you could avoid all the wetlands and still have 15 lots, that's probably not practical, probably not a viable project anymore to go from 200 down to 15. But if you could avoid the highest quality wetlands and have 182 lots, that might still be practicable, so there's those very common discussions, like pull it out of the valuable areas and, there's like an infinite number of alternatives really on-site configuration when it comes to things like that. So, and there's no magic, there's no bright line, like, well, you can go down to 80% of the number of lots you want. I mean, it just depends on the project and the site.
Yeah, I also think too, we can't lose sight of the actual wetland functions out there either. I look at off to the right there, I don't know what direction it is, the north. there's, that looks like a kind of a channelized wetland, right? Well, is there surface flow through there? Yes, you're avoiding that wetland to the very west of that large structure on the far north, but you're also impacting that entire wetland basin to the east of it. Which way is the water flowing? Is that wetland actually gonna remain up there? So just questions like that, whether it's minimization or avoidance, there's just a lot of them begging to be asked on this diagram.
That's a really good point. Secondary effects, cutting off hydrology to more wetlands that aren't even shown.
Right.
Good points. Any questions on this one?
Because Chad and I can go all day on this one. We're just getting started.
Residential.
This project is one of the ones, things like this come to mind when people talk about the core program and they say, well, you guys rarely ever deny permits. Which is true, but projects like this, which would, if this come in, looks like a denial, is most likely gonna be modified. And if they work with the resources and listen to the regulatory project manager, you might end up with a permittable project. So it's not a denial, but it's certainly not gonna be this amount of impact. I mean, I agree. This reminds me of some projects I got involved with on the enforcement side up in Hermantown, where 40-acre parcel, 36 1-acre lots, and, you know, a nightmare for the next 10 years, but hopefully things aren't done that way anymore and we can avoid those. But you look at things like this and there really would be a lot of discussion about reconfiguring this layout to avoid more of the wetlands.
11 years, I'm glad you brought that up. 11 years I've been back in this district. We haven't denied a permit. 4 years that we denied a permit. That doesn't mean some people threw something against the wall and pretty quickly realized they're going to give up because it's just, they realize it's not permittable. We didn't have to deny. Yes, that happens sometimes. But most of the time, and what we tell all our project managers, our job as public servants is to help people comply with the law. Our job is not to we're not opposed to development. We're not here to protect every wetland. That's not what our mission is. It's not even what the law says. We're objective, sitting on the fence, and just got to make sure that whatever's happening complies with the laws and regulations. It's that simple. Our job is to help applicants whittle their square peg so it's round and fit in the round hole. That's what it's all about. It's our job to help figure that out, not try to stop projects from happening. That's why we don't deny permits. Most of them, something gets permitted most of the time.
Is landowner refusal to sell land generally sufficient to reject an alternative?
Yeah, especially if it's in writing. There's a parcel in the same general area that, you know, a regulator points to, hey, why didn't you consider that? And they can put it in writing that, no, they actually can't acquire that. Again, it's, can you reasonably obtain that parcel? They can't reasonably obtain that parcel if the landowner won't sell it.
Same. So the definition of practicable is available and capable of being done considering cost, logistics, technology. The available part, sometimes we get an alternatives analysis that says, well, there was no for sale sign at the end of the driveway, so it must not be available. That's not enough. Actually inquiring and making offers and talking to people about whether it's, you know, they would be willing to consider selling it. Yeah, if they say no, it's not available.
Another variation of that question that I hear a lot is, we point, well, what about that alternative, using that existing road through your neighbor's land as an alternative to get to your build site? Approach that landowner, they say no, get into writing, put it in as on the application that demonstrates that that alternative is not feasible.
You mentioned zoning earlier, and that's one of, I'm waiting for a spot to say, anybody been involved, and any consultant been involved in helping an applicant get something rezoned or a zoning variance or something to make their project happen? It's not all that uncommon, right? For that reason, something just not being zoned perfectly doesn't always automatically eliminate an alternative. Because zoning can be changed all the time, in variances. Not every time, but there's got to be some good faith effort to see. Now, if you're like in the middle of like miles of residential, it's not going to be turned into commercial, you know, it's kind of obvious sometimes. There's a lot of these fringe areas, there's different zoning, there's a lot of opportunity to rezone, so something not being zoned right now, right, doesn't automatically necessarily.
You tee up one of my favorites, a preliminary plat.
So we can talk about
Preliminary. A final plat's final, preliminary plat is preliminary. if for whatever reasons, wetlands are not brought in right away, beginning, and it gets through preliminary plat, maybe I'm speaking more to LGUs, but you can go back and reconfigure that plat, to take into account wetlands, if it's preliminary. So I've seen that where LGU consultant, whoever says, no, this can't be changed because it's already a preliminary plat. Go back to the planning commission, bring the wetlands back into the equation, redo your plat accordingly.
Any other questions? You're in your seats, ready to go. Well, thank you, Chad and Dave, for helping out with this today. I think it was really good information, so hopefully you all learned something, and you guys can report back in a year and let us know how great all the applications were that came in, and all the alternatives analysis, and maybe we'll have a sort of a redux and we can go over those, but.
There's a sign-in sheet, we'll watch for your name. It'll just-
And thank you to Rebecca and WPA for allowing us to talk today. I think it was great to be back in person. Hopefully the hybrid model worked and the people online learned something too, but we appreciate your time today and a little extra time, and we'll be around for a little bit if you have any questions, but otherwise, we're all set. Thank you very much. Have a great day. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, I'll stick around.